the 16th?
Yeah.
That's the unambiguous
I
way.
know, that's what I did
Other
too.
than 3/4/5.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Nope.
No, you're not.
I'm not.
Sorry, I'm looking from the
Wrong side, yeah.
wrong side. You still have it for me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You're into the agenda. No, it's not mine. Something.
Oh, shit, no.
Yeah. I went through the themes and found the really most garish one I could find. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Welcome to the ACME working group session. If you're looking for the ICE session, then you might as well stay here because that one's been canceled. Since I've been asked, this animal is called rock hyrax. There's a family of those right next to my house. And
What is it related to?
it's related to the African elephant. Yeah, okay. So, you might have seen this thing, but not in quite such stark colors. And the agenda. So, the blue sheets are going around. The note well has been shown. And after this, we will do a very, very brief. After this, we'll do a very, very brief status update. And the email talk is going to be moved to the start because Alexei has to go to someplace else. That's the problem with being an AD. Always have to be places. And afterwards, we'll try to get the main document finished. Then telephony, star, ACME IP, and if time remains, open mic. Any agenda bashing? Okay, good. Just make sure you sign the blue sheets. Oh, right. Do we have a note taker?
We have gifts.
Oh, cool.
We can't start without notes or jabber. All you have to do is, all right, which one? So, notes or jabber? Which one you?
Oh, notes, thank you. And Jabber? Okay, thank you. There. Right. So since last time, we hoped that our main document would get published, but that didn't happen. And there is a new version, version 8, came out just last month. And we got a couple of directorate reviews from OpsDir and GenArt. And we have also new versions of all of our other drafts. So with this status update, let's go to presentations. Alexei?
Right, so I will do a status update on email TLS and SMIME. Next slide, please. Or do you have...
There is a clicker. Yeah, okay. So I'll connect it and it will work. Okay.
So based regarding the TLS certificates for email services, based on discussion in Prague, there were three options presented to implement challenges. One was DNS one was extra capability in SMTP or IMAP, and one was TLS hack. So I think based on discussion, the TLS one was removed. I cleaned up generally like description in the document, added references about subject alt names that needs to be present in certificates. So I added a proper reference for where this is described. RFC 7817, product of the UTA working group. I'm after adding comments to the document and sort of talking to myself in the document, adding comments and removing them. I decided that port is probably required in the challenge. So both service name and the port are required. So in theory, that allows to get to get a certificate for like SMTP or IMAP server running on non-standard port as well. And then, general fixing typos, adding references, etc. So I think so one question I had, whether the hash actually in the challenge covers the service and port fields that I added to JSON, and I think the answer is probably yes. So then the other question is for services like IMAP, they're typically running on a couple of ports. One is native TLS port, and another one is where you start and then you usually start TLS command and upgrade to TLS if available. So in theory, the same certificate can be used for both, but they are actually different port numbers and different service names. So probably you cannot get the same certificate for both in one go.
Bron Gondwana, port 143 is an abomination. We don't need to support port 143, just support port 993. The whole problem with things that allow you to upgrade in protocol is that they're a lot harder to...
It doesn't actually matter as far as the protocol is concerned. It has service name and port number. So it's, in fact, can be used for other services. So that doesn't really matter. And the last thing I thought about, are you, Richard, on the same one?
Yeah, same point. This does not really seem like an ACME issue. As long as the certificates you're issuing are agnostic as to the port number, it seems like in principle it should be fine. It's only if you are using something like an SRV name where you're specifying the port number in the certificate where you need to have some binding.
Yes.
So this just
I
seems
suppose
like
I was trying to think whether it's possible to get both subject alt name, SRV name in the same certificate in one go, and the answer is probably no. It's an optimization. I don't think it matters in practice, but
John Levine, the IMAP server I use now, I don't think has a provision for doing separate certificates for the two services. So combining them, I think, is important. And a related question is there a reason that POP is missing here? I use ACME to do a certificate for my POP server now.
No particular reason other than,
well, as a tiny data point, I use it.
Well,
mean, everything you say for IMAP applies equally to POP. You know, there's a capability
Except
thing and
for
there's-
it needs new POP capability if we're doing it this way, unless it's DNS challenge. For DNS challenge, it will work for all
Oh,
traces.
right.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to do capability challenges, you can adding into POP is roughly the same amount of work as adding into IMAP.
Right. Okay. I suppose we can add maybe a few other related challenge services as well in one go. But yeah. Okay. I was hoping nobody will mention POP, but you did. So now I have to add this.
Sorry, I have a lot of users that still use it.
Okay. And a similar vein, LMTP service, which is sort of a variant of SMTP for final delivery. Again, some of them are public facing, so they might need. I might as well support them as well. But for this, LMTP doesn't have a standard registered port number, and it doesn't even have the name registered. So I probably should do that anyway. Well, I can do it in separate document. That's not particular.
So, Alexei, you say you want to include the port under the hash. That seems sensible. Are you suggesting or even requiring that the ACME server insist upon a particular port number for these protocols?
Well, good question. Thank you for asking. I was debating it with myself. In theory, you can put any of this on a non-standard port. So that is still allowed, but I think CA might want to enforce it. Yes, potentially.
Yeah. So
I didn't want to put this as a requirement, but maybe I should say, CA may enforce that the port number correlate to the service.
I don't want someone spinning up the ability to run a TCP server on my machine on port 5000 is not necessarily a good indication that the person controls the machine. So you definitely want to have some text around this and maybe even strongly recommend that there be some policy at the CA that says if the port number is something other than the ones we've identified here, then it's probably not a good idea to accept this. Because we do the same thing for HTTP.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, so the analogy Martin was pointing to is the HTTP challenge. Only the CA will only connect to the validation server on port 80 because that is the HTTP port, which is supposedly privileged. And I think the analogy here is just to use the standard ports for the services we're talking about.
Okay. Okay, so next step, get more reviews, send and check. Richard should review. And if anybody is interested in implementing and playing with this, maybe we can do something in London. That should be a relatively simple extension for Let's Encrypt, for example, stuff. Right. As MIME, this is still rather raw. I've done some changes, but I think we really need to flesh out the exact mechanism, how the message is going to look like, and what to do here. But major changes, because in kernel, in LAMPS and kernel, we are updating crypto and adding internationalized email addresses to certificates and stuff like that. I might as well allow for them here so that we have just a single email identity that can be both internationalized or not. A bit more clarification about how the exchange messages, for now I'm thinking that they probably can be text plain to allow cut and paste from external programs for simplicity, and yet at the same time they can also be automatically generated, but comments on this are welcome. Richard?
So one thing that's not immediately clear to me from the document is whether you're trying to verify that someone who's trying to claim an email address can receive mail at that address, can send mail from that address, or both.
This is actually an open question, but I suspect the answer is both, because just receiving mail is a bit simpler in case you can intercept it. Ability to actually prove that you can send on the behalf of the user is probably slightly more powerful assertion.
Yeah, John Levine. Yeah, just being able to. I mean, if being able to receive mail is adequate, I can get an ACME. I can get an SYM certificate for any IETF mailing list, which is probably a bad idea, since it has a public IMAP server. On the other hand, there is no way to verify that someone can send mail from an address. I mean, I can put a name on the from line, and you can sort of wave your hands about SPF and DKIM and domain names, but you know. Beyond a certain point, you just have to say, well, maybe close enough. So this is not a problem we can solve technically, but it's definitely a security consideration that a certain amount of spoofing of identities for mechanically verified certificates is unavoidable.
Right.
Hirota Nakajima from Mercari. I think it's the same point that we can we can make sure that if we send the verification email to the receiver, and we can verify that he or she has that email address. But for sending, we need to make sure that he or she has certain email address. So we need to use other technology like not to spoof the email address. So like DMARC or those technology should be mentioned in the draft, I think.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, the only last observation I'll add is that verifying receive kind of matches the receive only would kind of match the state of the art in terms of the like send a magic link to an email workflows that we see for every web service in existence, right? Because there you send an email to someone and they click a link that goes to some web page, and you've only verified they've received that email. So I don't know if that's evidence of sufficiency, but it's evidence that it works in some other cases.
Right.
It's evidence,
and we're going to cut the mic after
which I'm
line
sure,
after that.
which for whatever that's worth.
The other one last observation I would add is that I'm looking at John Peterson here because it seems like there's probably some overlap between this and the empirical telephone number verification case. I don't know, like on the send receive both spectrum, if they align that, you know, if they're sufficiently similar to merit similar mechanisms, but
yeah, I mean, so John Peterson, return routability tests of various kinds have been used, right, to issue credentials for some time. I mean, if anything, we're stealing that from practices that have been around in email forever, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we have the benefit in the telephone case that especially for smart endpoints, there can be some other indications, right, that you can corroborate it with to strengthen it. Like if you've got cryptography in the SIM, right, card of your phone, maybe some of that can contribute. Identifiers that are specific to the network, you can kind of interrogate the network and get access to it, ask about where IMEIs are and things like that. But I mean, if what you're referring to, Rich, is potentially like kind of genericizing this a bit and defining a profile that you think encompasses both those return routability tests for this and then for that, I'd certainly be willing to work with you on that, Alexei, if you are interested.
Sure.
Richard, we've got the line.
Okay, right, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Okay.
Richard, now that you've sat down, you could get up.
you thought you were rid of me. So we're still talking about the base ACME draft.
Yeah, what
next slide,
happened with
please.
that? Oh, trying to make it interactive.
Do I need to like swipe to make it advance?
You've got
the
clicker. Oh, you can tell me.
All right, so since the last one, I didn't do the usual what we did slide because I figured you can all look at GitHub yourselves. Last few remaining to-dos that we managed to get the AD review comments from Kathleen addressed before this. Thank you, Kathleen, for those observations. We have a much longer GenArt review from Dale Worley to address. I you've seen some traffic on the list hasn't gotten to that. That's just back in the queue. I figured let's resolve I think we've got some substantial technical issues to resolve, and then I'll hit the generic comments as part of editing after that. So with that, I wanted to focus on this issue that we've had on the list that I think is past due to get resolution on. So the issue we've had here, so we've had this new order flow for a while, where you send in a new order request to request issuance. That provides you some authorizations from the CA that the CA wants you to fulfill before it'll issue the certificate. So the client goes off and fulfills those authorizations, and then it comes back to that order object and asks for the certificate and just downloads it with the GET request. So there's a question in this flow as to where in this flow it is appropriate to send the CSR. And I put an asterisk there to say, logically it's a CSR. It might be a list of a JSON object that represents the stuff that is logically in the CSR. Might be some additional fields that we've got that go alongside the CSR. But broadly, the stuff that is in a request for a certificate. So there are some cases where you want the CSR information at the beginning of this process, as we have it today. So as things are in the document today, you send in the CSR and any associated data at the beginning of the process so that the CA can look at this and provide guidance as to what you need to do, what proof you need to provide before the certificate will be issued. And that's something we don't want to lose in this editing. The revision that the Let's Encrypt guys asked for is that they don't want to bother spending storage on a CSR, which can be a fairly large object, until they have some evidence that someone's actually going to follow through, do these authorizations, and get a certificate. So they're trying to avoid incurring that cost before someone has gotten a certificate, because they can, in principle, just statelessly provide this advice as to what authorizations. They'll create the authorizations, but it's a smaller object than keeping the whole CSR around. So more or less statelessly provide the advice as to what to authorize without storing that CSR around. So they're interested in a flow where maybe a CSR gets sent in early in the process, but it kind of gets thrown away and sent again later on once you actually want the certificate, once you've actually done the authorizations and proved you've got the authority for it. There's kind of a second order issue here that the Let's Encrypt guys observed, that there's also this question of the last step where the client comes and gets the certificate. The document right now says the CA should proactively issue. So like once the last authorization gets proved, go ahead and issue it at that moment. And they observe that they have some cases where people do all the authorizations and then never ask for the certificate, and they don't want to spend the signing energy, the joules to issue a certificate if no one's ever going to ask for it. And there's been some debate on the list as to whether that can be addressed with by kind of being a little more lax in how proactive the CA has to be. Jacob, I think that's all I've got on the summary. So Jacob, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the reasoning on asking for that finalized change. It's less about abandoned cert flows and more about there's this N by M problem involving every order can have a bunch of authorizations on it, and every authorization can be a member of a bunch of orders. And so you wind up having to check a really large number of objects for every authorization that gets done, potentially. So this kind of smooths out the amount of work potentially done for every finished authorization.
You're saying that if there's a go ahead and issue this certificate request, then all you have to do is a linear number of requests, linear number of checks against the authorization.
Exactly.
So, right. So I wanted to highlight kind of all of the solutions here we're talking about have kind of the same general flow. You send in the CSR, as kind of did on the last slide. You send in the CSR, you get it, the server sends back information to the client about what the client needs to do to prove authority to get this certificate. The client goes around and does a bunch of work to prove it has that authority. And then the question we've got here before us today is whether you send this, whether you always do the second step where you send the CSR back in. And of course, at the end, you get the certificate from the certificate URL. So the two basic approaches we've got here are one with a pull request that Daniel submitted and one that I wrote up a couple days ago. On the left-hand side of the screen, the proposal is you always do the same flow. So in the language of the last slide, you always do step 4. There's always a second CSR submission, even if a CA has already cached the CSR from the first request and is ready to use that again. So this has the benefit that, you always do the same thing. There's no branch in your code depending on whether the CA is going to cache the thing or not cache the thing. So it's simpler from that. The cost here is that, if you're a client and you're only ever talking to a CA that caches things, then you're unnecessarily keeping around the CSR and retransmitting it. There's no utility to that. Deb.
Are you gonna check? How do you know that the CSR he sends the second time is the same as the CSR he sends the first time?
So that's an issue in either case where you send it twice.
Right.
Well, okay, go ahead.
It depends on exactly how you handle the second request, right? So one version of this is you handle the second request as if it were a de novo request and just look up to see if he has the right permissions to issue, and then you don't need to compare them because you don't care what the first one was just hinting, and only the second one matters, right?
Yeah.
So I mean that's what you do for. I mean, so like let's talk about the second issuance, right? Where you'd so say for the sake of argument that I go and I issue a CSR for A, B, and C, right? And then and I do all the nonsense you want me to do to issue, and now you have those permissions on my account, and now I come back with another CSR for A, B, and C. You can fulfill that right away. You don't need a new check. So my point is that you can simply treat the second round trip as if it were that subsequent issuance, and so in those cases you don't need to compare the CSR. So I mean, you can design the protocol in a way where you do have to compare the CSRs, or you can design the protocol in a way where you don't have to compare the CSRs, and surely the second would be better.
Yeah, so I mean, another way, so I didn't get around to describing the right-hand side, but basically, the right-hand side is we define a separate, some sort of switch the client uses to decide whether to do the second transmission. And another way you can view this dichotomy here is whether or not we view the first and second requests as part of the same flow, or whether we view them as decoupled things. First, as I was saying earlier, the first request is more or less a stateful thing that just gets advice. And the second, when you need a second one, as the actual issuance transaction. So the more decoupled case that Ecker was mentioning just now, this has the benefit that things are you only spend as much caching and as much bandwidth as you need to for a given CA in a given transaction. You don't cache a CSR if you don't need to cache the CSR. And as Ecker was mentioning, you get kind of this decoupling, where you can there's no coupling between, there doesn't need to be any coupling between the first and second requests, and so you can have a slightly simpler logic on the server by just considering each request on its own without having to bind a sequence of requests together. The cost is that the logic on the client is a little bit more complicated because it has to switch between the two cases. Yeah, Jonathan.
Jonathan Lennox. Why do you need the first CSR?
Say that again.
I guess at least in Ecker's model, where you only pay attention to the second one, is the first one just I want a request that looks kind of like this, but if it's different later, don't worry about it. I mean, you can sort of have just like a dummy that doesn't have any actual crypto in it or something.
Well, so one of the use cases for getting the CSR up front is that there are some legacy APIs that you might have behind an Acme interface that require the CSR at the beginning of the process. And in that case, they would really require that the second CSR be the same because the back end has done everything it's done premised on the CSR you sent the first time.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is really the only question I had for the working group is which of these approaches do we prefer? We've had some early discussion on the list around the kind of CSR plus CSR approach that on the left it was, as it was called before. And this is, I think, I've defined an error code as the switch here in this pull request, authorization first. This is called the authorization first approach on the list. But I would like to open the floor now for folks folks have any preferences between these two. Personally, my preference is for the latter because it keeps things a little more decoupled, as Ecker was saying, and minimizes kind of ugliness of unnecessary retransmits. But to be honest, I don't have a real strong opinion here. And I think Jacob might have a different opinion.
Yeah, hi. So I strongly prefer the former, or I should say I strongly disprefer the latter. The main reason being, I want to avoid things in this protocol where like one CA does something this way and another CA does something that way, because we're very likely to wind up with a proliferation of clients that only implement the one thing, and then we don't have an interoperable ecosystem. So rather than adding options for you do it however you want, I'd like to try to keep it relatively simple and straightforward.
Any comments, opinions from the floor in the room?
I mean, that isn't a crazy concern, but that's what interrupt testing is for. And I think actually having a sensible protocol hygiene is more important. And as I said in my email, I don't understand in the first one, like what my requirements are for the CSR and how to reason about the multiple CSRs and the security requirements on them.
You mean what the security requirements are in terms of what the CA needs to check between the two?
Yeah.
Jacob, do you have any thoughts on that? My instinct is to kind of punt that to CA policy, because ultimately the second one is what you're going to issue off of.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, one thing I mentioned on the list is, I think it would be fine even to say they should be the same and the CA can hash a hash and check that the hash is the same. I think that's fine.
But that means you seem to think they have to be the same. Why do they have to be the same? Do they have to be the same?
I don't think they necessarily do. I think you could also say, these aren't guaranteed. Like you said, this is a hint. This is how we choose to generate the set of identifiers, and the first one will be thrown away, and the final one will be ignored. It seems like the second one here is a response to ambiguity there, but I guess I don't see the issue with either case, either requiring that they be the same or specifically saying that the first one is ignored. Those both seem to work.
I think if we don't require one of those two, like,
I mean, the protocol needs to take a position on that. That's what the security protocol. So, like, I mean, I guess the fact that you're telling me that you don't seem to know the answer to this question actually is quite concerning to me. Because either it's okay if they're different, in which case the hash is unnecessary, or it's not okay if they're different, in which case the hash is absolutely necessary, and we ought to be able to answer that question.
Right.
So
I can tell you for our setup and policy, it's okay if they're different and the hash isn't necessary. I propose the hash mainly because my assumption with your comment on the list was that you wanted them to be identical, and that was the way to solve it. But if you don't feel like they need to be identical, I don't either.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are cases where the CA is going to require them to be identical for these legacy API reasons. But I think, as Jacob says, if you do the checks before issuance on the second one, then to some degree it doesn't matter what the first one was.
Well, I mean, as long as the protocol says you have to issue off the second one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Jacob, do we agree that that's, like you'd say, you do all your pre-issuance checks on the second one submitted?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, but again, the protocol has to say if that to be the same or not, because otherwise you'll have non-interoperable clients. So I mean, like, my complaint is this is a great opportunity for screwing things up in a bunch of different ways.
I agree. So would you be happy with number one if we said the first CSR is the public key is ignored, extensions are ignored, the only one that really matters is the second one?
I would be happier.
Right.
I could tolerate it, I suppose.
I think the way I would be inclined to state this is to say, whatever checks a CA does on an issuance request have to be done with regard to the CSR sent in the second request.
But I guess
you could do that up front by requiring that the second request be the same as the first.
But no, I don't think that works, because exactly the point Jacob was raising earlier about interoperability. Like, my understanding is the reason we are in this soup is that there are some CAs which need the thing up front, which means they must intend to issue off that thing. And so therefore, if that's true, they must check off that thing, and therefore, if that's true, they must be the same. And so, like, am I missing something? Okay, so they have to be the same. The client has to retry them, which means the server has to check. Because the server doesn't check, then then what's our reasoning? I mean, our reasoning is that it may not be that if they're required to be the same, then the server has to rely on them being the same, which means that the servers that check they have to be the same or may have problems. Yep. And so now we have like an opportunity for like a covert error on the server, right? Maybe that's the way it's just the soup we're in. But it seems to me like this drives us to the point where like if this is to be all acceptable, then it seems to me that they have to be identical, given the situation you just told me.
That's certainly the easiest case to reason about. I think it's slightly more conservative than might be strictly necessary, but I think it helps with the interop problems you're noting and the invisible defect problems.
So Martin Thompson, this suggestion that we need CSR at the beginning of the order flow as well as at the end is what I'd like to push on a little bit. What situations require the CSR up front and at the end? Because if it were only a problem of at the point of issuance that you need the CSR, then you could create the order with a list of identifiers.
So the situation, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the situation where you want it in both places is when you want it up front in order to tell the client what to do, but then you want to throw it away because you don't want to cache it yet. And you need it at the end when you're actually going to do
it. So what aspects of the CSR are needed in order to tell the client what to do? It's just what identifiers, right?
Well, this is in the PR right now. The issue that runs into is with these legacy APIs that actually need a CSR.
What do you need twice?
Well, so, okay, in the case where you need CSR-like stuff twice, you don't need the CSR the first time, you just need identifiers. But in the case where you need it only at the front, you need a CSR.
So I think what I think has happened based on this conversation is that you have decided to try to take two entirely different flows and unify them. And because you don't want the client to somehow have to know which flow is in play. And like, it seems like either you need the CSR up front or you need the CSR later. You don't need them both. And the problem is the client just doesn't know which one it is, right? I mean, so like, wouldn't it be better to solve this problem by having two flows and having an advertisement where the server told you which flow he demanded?
I mean, like I said earlier, I think only one of those flows will get implemented. I mean, the issue with the ecosystem today is, there's about, actually, I would guess 50 to 100 Acme clients, which is awesome, but they're all essentially Let's Encrypt clients, right? And a lot of them are likely to implement Acme v2 as Let's Encrypt rolls it out. And we want those clients to interop with the other CAs, the CAs that have these legacy flows that need the CSR first. So the question is, how can we design the protocol such that those clients are incentivized to build something that will work with everyone?
Yeah, like future's bigger than the past. Yep. I think I guess like I mean the idea seems to be we should like make all those clients now change and adopt some clunky flow because we can't. The CAs who have the old clunky flow can't change to a new less clunky flow, and that doesn't seem like the right answer. That seems like the wrong distribution of work.
Yep. So my ideal answer is actually what's in PR 342, which is we don't send the CSR first at all. We just send the identifiers, CSR last. From talking to other CAs, it sounds like that's kind of the more modern way. They tend to think of the CSR as just a vehicle for the public key once all the other stuff is done. I think what we really need to hear from here is directly from CAs who have an API that needs CSR first and will have trouble adopting Acme without this flow.
Right. So it sounds to me like you and I prefer the same thing, which is 342.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to really be convinced as a working member. I'd like to really be convinced that we really need to support the CSR upfront flow, as opposed to telling people that we not only need to support it, but that we need to force every client in the universe to do something annoying because we don't want people to because we're so terrified that those clients will not be willing to implement the other flow that apparently CAs need.
Rich Saul's no hats. Could we make the error code be generic so that whenever you get this error code, resubmit with the CSR, and then say the CSR whenever submitted must be the same one?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't totally follow.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it. What you said?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm suggesting that we have one flow, but that in either phase in the step or either step in the flow, you send back an error code that says, I need the CSR now.
Could work.
And then, clients maybe, whenever they see this code, they'll just, send the CSR and resubmit.
Yeah, I think I'd need to see the PR to understand exactly how you're thinking about generalizing. So a question to Jacob. I'm a little surprised that 342 works for some of the cases that Let's Encrypt is doing now, like wildcards. So if someone's coming along to ask for a wildcard certificate, do they know, is the expectation they know what names to ask for that wildcard? I would think that you would want to, yeah, go ahead.
So one of the concepts introduced in 342 is an identifier notion that's a little different from the identifiers we use in authorization objects. So in authorization objects, so far, the definition has been an identifier for a DNS name can never have a wildcard. The identifiers you ask for in a new order, according to 342, can have a wildcard code. So in other words, they are equivalent with DNS names as defined in the certificate. So if you want a wildcard, you stick a wildcard identifier in your new order request. The current policy plan for Let's Encrypt is that will generate a single authorization object with a DNS challenge for the base domain. We don't currently have any plans to generate N authorization objects for random subdomains. If a CA wanted to implement that, they still could, because the input does have that wildcard character in it.
So basically, in the 342 sort of proposal, you would take the collection of DNS name SANs, translate those to identifier objects, and send those in.
Yep.
Martin, do you have a comment?
Martin Thompson, just an editorial comment. I think I like 342 as well. I just noticed in there that, yes, you do allow them to be wildcards, but you don't actually define what format is. And I think to be a little bit more precise and simply say that each specific type of identifier needs to precisely define what it means to have a wildcard and the format of it. And I think for DNS it's really straightforward. The leftmost label is a star, but you need to actually write that down.
Well, I don't think we need to define wildcards for arbitrary name types. I think
right.
Say for DNS, the way you talk about a DNS wildcard is leftmost label star.
So this is in a generic section of the of a generic protocol. So you can say that unless the identifier type has a wildcard type defined, it just doesn't apply. But it should be relatively straightforward editorial. Just wanted to make sure that on GitHub as well.
Okay, so it sounded like there's a fair bit of mass behind 342 here. What I might suggest, I'll ping the folks. I think Andrew Ayer from SSL has the back ends that require the CSR up front. So I'll ping him, see if I can get him to provide some feedback. It seems like kind of picking up on Ecker's future is bigger than the past point. Like we might be able to have some small extension that adds some affordance to these legacy things where you have some signal in the dictionary, in the directory object that says you need to send a CSR in your new order and then re-add the CSR in the new order field as an affordance to these legacy APIs. And then the main body of Acme Compat is focused on the going forward use case that people are more happy with. And then clients can implement the legacy affordance or not.
So as chair, but with a bit of snark, instead we called it a change cipher spec message. I mean, it is analogous. It's the exact same thing, right? It's longer, but and then you can write the doc to act, but you could say, multiple ones, and the server has the option to act on whichever one it wants. So the client, therefore, the burden of making sure it's doing the same thing goes back to the client.
Hey.
Mine, this is probably I don't know if it has been discussed. Is there any difference in terms of robustness for denial of service attacks? Some resource exhaustion attacks, somebody launches a bunch of requests with no intent of validating. And so there's some time, I mean, there's obviously time involved while the validation is going on. Is that a concern at all? Or? Either way.
But I think that that's kind of what kicked this whole thing off is that Let's Encrypt was worrying about people sending in CSRs that they had to store,
right,
and consuming that storage. So there was
I'm primarily concerned about essentially intentional attempts to have them buffer 1 million CSRs.
Yeah.
In that, as opposed to kind of just normal operation.
Yeah, that was the concern that prompted this. I think in terms of the really expensive operation for the server, I think is the validation operation where you've got to go out to the internet and make some HTTP queries. In order to trigger that, the client has to do several HTTPS requests and some crypto computation. So there's some cost to that. Imposing that cost on the server has some cost to the client. Yeah. Okay, so just to wrap that up, I think sounds like the room here is pretty keen on 342. Any last comments before we wrap this?
Think we should take a hum?
Sure.
Okay, so the proposed way of going forward is to accept PR 342. Okay, hum now if you understand the proposed way forward. Hum now if you don't. Okay, that's good. So assuming this, that we understand what the issue is, how many agree that this is the good way forward? Hum now. Yeah, that's 342. Okay. So how many do not think this is a good way forward? Okay, Richard, I guess you've got your guidance.
Yeah, so I'll work with Daniel to get 342 landed and talk with the folks who have legacy APIs to see if we need to add some affordance for backward compat.
Yeah. Just leave us the clicker. We want your clicker back.
I don't know, how do you like Christmas? So that should be fairly straightforward. I'll send a ping off to the legacy folks now, and getting the PR tuned up, I should be able to do like in the next week or two. I haven't honestly looked all the way through Dale's review, so I don't have. It's a little bit more, but my sense is that it's a little more editorial, so that should hopefully be straightforward. So I want to say by like early December, we'll get a rev. Is that? I believe the chairs are looking at Kathleen.
Yeah, assuming that this is the only substantive technical issue, do you want us to go through another working group last call, or just move it forward after like a week? Okay.
What does selective mean? Abbreviated?
Diff. Read the diff.
Yeah.
So Kathleen Moriarty. So just like they're doing in TLS, you could just do a narrowly focused working group last call on just any areas of question, not the whole thing.
And remind, has this been IETF last called yet? Chairs? Has this been IETF last called yet?
No, it has not.
Okay,
No.
so there's no re-IETF last call.
Hasn't.
What was that?
So there wouldn't be a question of a re-IETF last call.
No. We haven't gotten to that.
Hasn't even been telechatted yet, right?
Well, the order of events would be a finished working group last call. Then it's typically the AD review, and that's been done. And then it would go to IETF last call, and then a telechat.
Okay.
So hopefully we can do this soon, because it'd be nice to get this wrapped up with me as opposed to having another AD have to go through a review and stuff. So as early as we can get this, the better.
Yeah, I very much hope we can get this done well before March.
Oh,
Good.
yeah. That's. Yeah. For old lang syne. So, okay. Let's see if Mary's online.
Mary, can you raise your hand? Yeah, she's in the meeting room.
Yeah, but we can do the slides. She just needs to talk. And just the room for me. Mary had some health issues, so she's not going to be in this room. She's remote from elsewhere in a hotel. And she's just lost audio, so maybe Jonathan goes first.
Hello, John Peterson. Honestly, probably both Mary and I are presenting like the same material, right, basically, and trying to pose the same question. So I will try to make this cover both of us as much as we can, though Mary, please do get in, interject, contribute, and we'll get to your slides. Next slide. Just for those of you that have not been tuning into this, we have this crazy idea, right? That we're going to try to figure out a way to like certify and sign telephone calls in order to prevent the impersonation that is just endemic in enabling robocalling. Wouldn't that be an amazing thing to be able to do? One of the main problems behind this, of course, is figuring out how to get security credentials essential to this down to the devices that need them. Our good friends here at the IETF suggested maybe Acme would be able to help with that. And so over in the STIR working group, we've been working on this. We already have a certificate profile for that, which we've articulated pretty well. We have some extensions to the typical X509 profile for this that are specific to the use cases we're considering there. There's kind of two branches of it. One that concerns what we're calling service provider codes. And these are codes that are kind of like internal code points to the telephone network, what you use to identify like that you're a carrier and that you're legit in the PSTN, as we call it. And then a second profile that's focused on telephone numbers in particular, and being able to issue credentials that are, would let even an end user potentially have like a certificate for their telephone number. That would be very difficult to administer and manage, however, without something like an Acme infrastructure, which is why we are here. Next slide. This, if you don't know anything about STIR, is kind of what it looks like. We assume there's a logical authority. We assume that there are these kind of endpoints like clients in the telephone network. In some cases, those user endpoints might be IP enabled. They might be speaking SIP natively. In other cases, they might be connecting up to some kind of intermediary that then is doing this over IP. I keep hearing actually like a lot of the telephone network is now really IP. It's some, you probably know better than me, Henning. It's like some people say like 50% or something, even if like landline calls are getting to there, but all of the cellular network and things like that moving towards VoLTE, lots of IP around that. So we'll see more end-to-end IP through it, but some of it is still largely intermediated. The issue is though, we need these logical authorities. We're going to push these credentials down and you're going to be able to sign with them and then verify it on the terminating side to make sure that in fact, the telephone number is not being impersonated by the calling party. Next slide. So when we started looking at those logical authorities and we're looking around for what might apply to that, is that Mary? I think I see.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm here. So I got audio, but I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. I just wanted to be in the queue.
Yeah. If you could like dial down the volume a little. You're pretty loud in the room. Okay. You muted? Still a little squeaky. Okay, that's better. Good. So yeah, we started looking at Acme through a STIR lens. Imagine, hey, we could have these certificate authorities. There could be some kinds of challenges and proofs that we would perform for Acme clients, and these clients would then be able to provision down these credentials. Sounds fantastic. Next slide. But then we get down to what are the conditions we're going to use for these challenges and these proofs. And this is where we have some interesting things to discuss here today. We need some input from the group on kind of what the way forward is for this. As Alexi was alluding to, obviously there are return routability mechanisms that seem interesting for this, especially for the telephone number case. I can imagine, again, something simple like an SMS challenge, right? Provided that it was reinforced with something a bit meatier, because of course SMS has all these potential vulnerabilities as well. So you want to make sure that you have, among other things, repeated tests to make sure you retain control of the number, but also some kind of a secondary factor, whether it's the network telling you that this is a proper registration or something similar to that, ideally, to get that to work. That basic idea is in a document called Draft IETF-ACME Telephone. And we're still kind of fleshing it out. This is all relatively preliminary at this point, in part because we want to talk about some of these approaches and get a sense from the room here of what people think we should do. The alternative is some kind of a top-down attestation. Obviously, there are authorities who issue telephone numbers today. You get your telephone number from a carrier. I know there are use cases carriers are interested in, where they could delegate some of that authority for a telephone number down to, say, an enterprise that is a customer of theirs. And they want them to be able to have a credential they could use to sign for these calls. A lot of enterprises are using IP telephony today. But how will you really do that? And in Mary's service provider draft IETF-ACME service provider, she proposed some token, basically, that you would go out and acquire from an authority for the specific case of these SPCs, these service provider codes that we have in the STIR certs document. And, you know, these service provider codes in North America, there are things we call them OCNs. They're issued by a particular authority. You kind of go to this entity. They're the person who decides who gets to have which of these kind of 4-digit codes. And so the thinking in the ACME service provider draft was, great, there should be a way that you can kind of get a token from someone who is at least connected to that chain of authority. And it's a bit complex how this is working out, like implementation-wise in North America. There is this notion there will be a policy administrator that will be connected then to this entity that is actually responsible for issuing these SPCs. But I mean, that complexity aside, it's not so salient to how we implement this here. The basic idea that you can like go get a token from some authority who controls a namespace and then deliver that token to an ACME service and get a certificate in response seems like something that just ACME should have built into it. So next slide. So this got me thinking, because again, I was looking at this, okay, there's this one use case, right, where you're a carrier and you're getting these service provider codes and you're going to this authority for that. Then there's this use case where like you're an enterprise and you're going to your carrier to get a token from them potentially, and then bring that to the CA. Surely like there just must be a need in ACME for some generic mechanism that basically where an ACME server has some pre-existing trust relationship with an authority of this kind, the ACME server can challenge you and say, look, you need to go get a token from this entity that I know controls this namespace. And if they think that you're legit and they give you back something cryptographically signed, I'll give you your cert. And like, you know, when I started thinking about them, like there could probably be all kinds of use cases for that in ACME. Like, you know, let's say that you're like Easy Pass, right? Or Fast Track on the West Coast of the United States, the toll things for highways. You know, maybe you go to, you know, the license plate authority, right? If you want to sign up for Easy Pass and you want to be able to get a cert from them, they say, go to the license plate guys, get the proof that you in fact control this license plate in a token. And if you provide that to me, I will give you a cert that in fact certifies, attests that you control that license plate number, and that we'll use that to bill you and so on. So, I mean, you know, given the potential amount of just generic things you could probably use this way, I propose that we have an authority token that's just kind of separate, and that the kinds of use cases Mary and I are talking about would just use this generic mechanism, which would have some subtyping in it. Next slide. So this is a straw man, and like don't critique my where my brackets are or anything in this. It's just to convey the general idea that we'd have a type that's for this token, for this generic token. It would have some subtyping in it. You would have a token type. That token type would be governed by some kind of registry, because different authorities might require you to get different tokens. Some might want to do OAuth, some might want to do JOTS, somebody wants to do Kerberos, I don't know, right? Whatever it is that you need to do to go get a token, this thing tells you the kind of token you need to go get, and even proposes, you know, if you need it as a hint, here's a URL of a place, you know, who the authority is, and if you go to that website, this is probably where you can navigate this and get what you need. Then that's probably would be optional, but the token type would be required. So, for example, we would have a TN auth list thing to get for SPC, a separate one to get for telephone numbers, a separate one for Easy Pass, and those would be the types that would fill up that IANA registry. Next slide. So I know Mary wants to talk about this as well, and I mean, I don't make any decisions about anything until you hear what she has to say. She has a draft that approaches this slightly differently, and I think the discussion we want to have is kind of what approaches for this seem like tractable and useful ones for the group. But if people think this is a good idea, I think we should do something generic like this. Very similar to what the conversation is with Alexei, right? Where if there seems to be a general need for like a return routability as a kind of challenge that we're interested in, let's build systems that let you, extend it and subtype it for the kinds of use cases people might be interested in. Chris, did you want something before Mary talks? Or?
Yeah, we're going to hold the general conversation till after Mary presents, so only if you have a clarifying question about what Jonathan was talking about.
Hopefully it's a quick one.
Yeah.
You sort of imply the Acme service reaching out to the authority to get the token. Are you
No, I
married
just
to that?
suggested that there's some pre-association.
Okay.
So again, it's probably you'll get a challenge, right? And then that'll tell you which authority you need to go talk to if you didn't already know. And for some use cases, you'll probably already know who you need to talk to. Okay, Mary, you're up.
She's trying to get back. She's trying to get back on. We'll just give her a minute.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
Good.
Okay, all right. So if you can put up the slides, it'll be fast, the stuff I'm going to run through. So I think John and I effectively, the outcome's the same what we're trying to do. I think the approach is slightly so. Okay. Actually, it may be faster for me to keep trying to run my own PowerPoint. Okay, so y'all have the slides on the screen. I can't see them right now.
Mary, we're looking now at slide number 2, and
Okay,
let's say slide number.
that's fine, because I don't see slides, but I've got my PowerPoint up, so I'm going to run through it. Okay, so the feedback at last IETF that we should have a more generic token challenge mechanism, that we could use it for service provider codes. And John talked about that a little bit. And again, John talked about his proposal. At this point, I didn't make any changes to the workgroup document because obviously we need to agree the approach. Okay, next slide, please. And so what I did.
You've been cut off, lost the audio.
This is John again. Mary, while you're reconnecting, I mean, I hesitate to like characterize this, but I think we can at least, if it would be helpful to the chairs, I could try to say what I think the distinction is, but.
Sure. Yeah. Please.
Yeah.
To the room.
Right, sure. So do you want me back up or should I? Or Mary, are you on?
I'm on back. Sorry about that. This audio is just crap. Okay. So let's run through the slides because I have a few. That's okay. Okay. I'm assuming y'all can still hear me. Okay, so what I did just in a workgroup document was add feedback that we got specifically on that. Just a couple things. So hopefully y'all can hear me. I hear background noise. I'll just keep talking and then John can talk over me later. Okay, so I added text about the lifetime of the service provider code and just changed. We had this subfield to be an array of strings rather than a string. Okay, I'm not hearing any audio. I assume y'all hear me. Okay. Oh, and I need to speak slowly if y'all can still hear me. Okay, so on slide 4, here's the what I propose is the generic mechanism. It's effectively the same as the model. Okay.
John Peterson back at the mic. Should I give it a shot or what do I do? Yeah.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, So I think the original Acme service provider draft, right, was very specific to the SPC use case. And SPC is, like I said, these like 4-digit codes, basically. And so, yeah, last time actually at Acme, I said we need to figure out a way to make this more generic. So I think the proposal that Mary was looking at was to then create, to migrate away from SPC and into a generic entity code. The entity code, though, pretty much has the same syntax as the SPC does. The notion being...
Closer to the mic, please.
Oh, sorry. And again, forgive me if I'm not getting it quite right. This is my understanding of it. The entity code uses the same syntax effectively that the original SPC did, under the notion that pretty much any generic authority that you'd be talking to would have some identifier for you, right? And that would kind of tell then the CA what kind of credential they needed to give you. Chris, do you think that's fair? You can speak this too. You're working on this. And so I think that's the distinction, or the one that we're interested in discussing, is how generic we want this to be and exactly where we kind of put in the extensibility that tells you what kind of credential is ultimately going to be issued. And so I'm kind of arguing, I guess, for a model where we use subtyping, where we use an IANA registry that is going to specify how these tokens work in particular. And I think that this approach, the approach that's in the service provider draft, is kind of more focused on identifying just that entity designation than on something that could potentially use, say, different forms of tokens or things like that.
Chris went, yeah. I think John covered it pretty well. I think the main difference in the conversation, at least, between the document, service provider really corresponds to the shaken stuff that we've done in the stir domain. In terms of the service provider code, the question is, would that document now refer to this other document? And what is the generic mechanism that we come up with? And I think if I were to, do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is what John was talking about with the token challenge. And I think the attempt here to make it generic was to provide an entity rather than talking about specifics of service provider code. And if I were to understand John's proposal and the difference there, it is that instead of having a predefined entity code, we have a type that's defined in a profile document or something like that. And then that characterizes all the claims and other things. And my personal opinion is I'm fine with that approach. Sort of wish Mary was here to give her position as well. But I think there's Mary.
Okay. Can y'all hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I didn't get to talk about it, but so the separation, I had two other documents, right? One is intended to be generic, right? And there might be a typo in there where I forgot to change service provider code. So effectively what I took the other document and broke it out, right? So the one mechanism is generic, and then the other is just an example on how to use the service provider code. Because in that model, you don't need all this registration. It's a little bit lighter weight, in my opinion. So it doesn't put as much knowledge of how we're doing this, I think, in the Acme server, right? And so it's totally up to the authority and its relationship with the entity to figure out, the value of the token and the unique identifier.
John Peterson. Yeah, I think that's correct. I think it is much more lightweight. I think, again, though, that... Get on the other mic? Or... Maybe I need to do this. Mary, can you mute when I'm talking?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thanks. I was going to say, yeah, so it's definitely lighter weight, but I guess since we have to assume a pre-association between the authority and the CA anyway, right? Because there is a trust relationship, there is a pre-association. I don't think you can really kind of get around the notion that they need to share knowledge, domain expert knowledge, right? of what kind of namespace this is and what kinds of credentials get issued for it. And like, given the degree of potential variability in that, if we truly want to make this generic, I think the lighter weight of this just kind of limits what kinds of things you can end up talking about, and it won't make the problem go away of having to have the server have behavior that is specific to the domain, because it needs to be able to issue a certificate that is specific to the attesting authority for the domain.
Okay, yeah. So I'm back. Yeah, so I see your point, because I was doing it in the original service provider code document was from the perspective that the PA and the CA already had that trust relationship, right? And in the shaken model, we absolutely have that, right? Because we're not, the entity, the service provider isn't using a CA that hasn't been, authorized, sanctioned by the PA, if you will, right? So we do have a more restrictive model. So I can see how, I guess we can make that a little more generic. Okay.
I mean, ultimately, I want to make it a lot more generic, so it could work for my easy case, right? Or like for security numbers, for photos, or again, it just seems to me like there's a ton of potential things in Acme that we could use this for. But this is a question for the room, right? In the sense of, people may think, no, actually, we should keep this narrow.
Yeah. Well,
it's not interesting to make it that generic. That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah, because my opinion is that it doesn't cost anything to not be generic, right? And my concern, and again, we'll open up to the group. My concern is that if we try and open up and make it too generic, we're going to get use cases, dozens that we need to evaluate to make sure it works for those situations, right? And so, people have already implemented the shaken stuff and it works, sort of thing. So I'll be quiet now and let others speak.
This is Richard Barnes. I think that this is worth doing generically. I've had a similar use case in mind for DNS names for a while. Wouldn't it be nice, even for the DV case, if the CA could get information directly from a registry as to who holds which domain names? So I think it's worth at least including that case. I think the thing we just need to struggle with here is what the right axes are for generalization. The only one of these drafts I've read is John's, and that seems roughly correct to me in terms of branching on token type, and I don't remember if it identifies the authorities. You might have to identify what authorities might be acceptable to the CA so that the client knows whether it's got a workable token or not. Okay, there you go. Yeah. I'm broadly supportive of this approach. I think it's great if it addresses the service order use cases, and I think it's got some legs to move forward and address some other stuff in other spaces as well.
Chris went. I agree that it'd be good to have a generic. I do see all the other use cases. I think maybe one thing we could do is have maybe a more sort of a default mode where there's like a UUID or something like that as a code. And, it's probably a scenario where, I don't know, 80-90% of the folks using this may have just pretty much the same mechanism. So that could be one, I don't know if it's a compromise or actually a feature that, you don't have to necessarily define every single use case, something to consider.
I just want to point out that we already adopted both basically John's document and Mary's document. And if they're converging, then, maybe John and Mary should get together with Chris and Richard, and get together and come up with a converged document. If that's where you think you're going and where the room supports.
Right. So this is John. Yeah. So there are two individual submissions that we did for this IETF, one from Mary and one from me, just for the generic token challenge of this. So really we're trying to figure out, yes, can we merge those, right? And if we do, then I totally agree. Both the service provider document and the TN document would then rely on that merged generic one. And yes, I'm happy to put in Chris's UUID case. I think that makes a lot of sense. I love the DV case. So I think it's a win-win, provided we can all just kind of circle around on that.
Mary, any opinion on your side?
No, John, Chris, and I will work together and see. Again, so the one point was, the linkage in the role of the authority is slightly different, right? The balance between that and the CA. And so that's a slight difference. That is why I'm a little bit reluctant to throw it out generic.
Right. So I would, it's John again. I would say, Mary, again, I don't see a free lunch in this one, right? I mean, I think you can assume it, but like that's assuming that there's still a ton of domain knowledge that's in the CA, that it understands how to issue things that look like stir certs, and again, that those are the things that tie this down to that particular use case. When you say we can just do this as something as narrow as entity code, so I think once if you accept that you want anything more than that level of pre-association, then yeah, you end up effectively with tokens and subtypes and everything else we're talking about. But I would appreciate if there's anybody else in the room that's interested in this, speaking to it. So please.
Ted Hardy. So I generally like the mechanism you guys are converging on, where you use a generic mechanism that allows you to do this sort of token-based. I generally approve of the direction this is going on, but I do want to just have a slight thing on the amount of domain knowledge that you need. And I think that you still require a certain amount of domain knowledge in the CA to know something about, let's call it the number space that you're eventually going to issue the CA for, the certificate for, because I don't think there's any way to get away from the fact that what a wildcard means in Stirland and what a wildcard would mean in a regular domain name FQDN are completely different. And so you need some level of domain knowledge. And I agree with you that you don't want to make that like really heavyweight. And I very much like this direction, but let's not try and get it so generic that we expect every CA to be able to stand up the knowledge that it would take to deliver these certificates of what are fundamentally different types.
Just to briefly clarify the context here, though, the context we're talking about here is within an authorization transaction, at which point you've already specified this is the specific identifier you're validating. So I think we don't run into the questions of wildcards, et cetera. I don't think there's a wildcard issue here.
Ted Hardy, I agree. I'm just trying to say that the amount of state can only get so low, right? Because you have to be able to match it to what kind of identifier is going to be issued. And there are some of these identifiers which are functionally issued with only one reference authority. And that kind of identifier, the amount of state you're willing to take is whatever the reference authority requires.
Chris, you also have to assume that the ACME implementation needs to support STIR certificates as well. So there's, a couple levels of qualification that have to happen before you can actually give a certificate. So.
Go ahead.
So John Peterson, yeah, guidance from the room is that me and Chris and Mary and Richard should talk more about this, or is there any more specific guidance in that?
I think the guidance is not only talk, but come up with a single submission, and then we can call for adoption.
Okay.
Hopefully before London.
Do we need to hum on that, or does anyone find or have objections with bringing this on, as a new work item? We'll make sure the charter if it has to be adjusted, we'll deal with that. But all by London, the goal would be to have this on a new submission as a working group doc.
My impression is probably shouldn't matter from a charter point of view, because I think we're trying to address the same set of use cases. It's just a different question of document factoring.
It depends on how generic they make it. You guys make it. All right, great. And Mary, thanks for slugging it out there through the illness and stuff.
Next up is STAR. Do you want a clicker, or do you want? You can take the clicker, or you can tell me to. The computer's here, though, so don't point to the screen.
So we did a lot of changes. that were triggered by a review that Martin did a couple of months ago. Unfortunately, we missed the cutoff date, and we're sorry about that. And we submitted the 01 version of the draft only on Sunday night. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to glance through the draft. No one? Well, no problem, because I'm going to go through the... Okay, a couple of people. Well, Diego. So the first thing was removing CDN-specific text from the introduction, and then just clear out all the lurk-specific baggage. As a result of this, we also changed the document title, which now doesn't talk about any delegation and reads as support for star certificates in ACME. So delegation is one of the main motivation for this for us as well, but it's not the only use case and not the main topic of the draft, which instead should just describe the mechanics of the protocol and the mechanics of how star can be layered on top of the ACME ecosystem. Then we did this pretty important change. Previously, we were doing a simple delete, which was not authorized, and then so pretty tragic. So Martin's suggestion was to use post and JWS the way ACME does, and so we did. Then we worked on things related to time. So yeah, previously we were doing, we were considering the amount of time that the extended renewal period is, the extended renewal period exists for as a time that depends on the point on when the actual the first certificate is issued by the CA, whereas we've changed to use absolute dates. So the ACME client requests a well-defined period in terms of absolute dates, and then of course the ACME server can reply and correct this. And as needed. The other thing we did was change the granularity for each of the short-lived certificates, which now is expressed in seconds instead of days. We could have done hours or minutes, but seconds seem to be. Why not? Any objection? Sorry? Okay. And then we did some work with the response being more specific on what we return in case, for example, the certificate has been cancelled or explicitly cancelled, or the whole lifetime of the thing has expired, and so we are using RFC 7807 format. And of course, we had to add a couple of entries in the corresponding YANA registry. And then we added as per BCP 205, we added an implementation status section, which described the open source implementation that Telefonica did on top of Boulder and Certbot, with pointers to the actual code. And of course, this exists. This is an ephemeral section which exists only for the period of time that the draft exists. When the draft goes into the publication queue, then it will be removed, of course, because it doesn't matter anymore. A few edits, purely editorial stuff. We now describe the exact semantics of the field, and with types and semantics instead of inlining comments into the exchange. And then one thing that we did that was that it is a TBD thing, that is still TBD, is that we had this elaborate security section security consideration section, and we think we need to think about this a bit more. Also, in the light that now we're looking at the delegation of one of the possible use cases for this. So this would be an item which will be worked actively on for 402. Yeah, together with the other hot topic, which was the interaction with the certificate transparency. So on Monday, we went to the trans working group. I had a conflict, so Diego had to present this, and maybe you can tell us what do they say?
Hi, John Peterson. With my use case that is not quite domain names, I do appreciate the de-lurkage that you did thus far. That whole term though, DNO, like the notion that there's this domain name owner and that's what like actually cancels an automatic renewal, still doesn't quite fit the language of my use case, but I love like being able to do exactly what you're doing. And so just a little bit less specificity of the domain name part of this, and Stir would totally use this. So don't make me like write my own draft that does exactly what you're doing, but you know, substitutes out DNO for like Stir stuff. Okay.
Right. Okay.
I'm happy to help if I can be helpful in getting that edit in.
Thanks.
Sure. Sure. Very brief. Diego Lopez. I was at the trans meeting, introducing the problem and the idea that temporary certificates in general imply for CT. There was I would say, I mean, if others like Eckhart that were there have any comments, happy to come here, but my impression, hey. No, simply my personal impression is that the problem was acknowledged. It was discussed whether there was a real problem or not, or the current infrastructure could be able to deal with. There were people that it's not a general agreement in one direction or the other. And all in all, my what I got from the final conclusion from Melinda was precisely that they would welcome some kind of document describing the problem and making some proposal. And why, for example, STAR certificates could be treated in a, let's say, special way by cities. What is not clear, apparently, is that trans is thinking whether to continue or not in the coming months, and maybe that is not precisely the right place to bring any draft that we had in mind. But we have this session with Joaf later on, so probably this is one of the things we could discuss.
AD hat off. Yeah, I mean, my sense of that meeting, frankly, was that people didn't really think it's much of a problem to just issue shortlist certificates directly into the CT, given the lifetime of the certificates you actually can plausibly issue for short-lived. So, I mean, like in terms of clock accuracy, you really can't go below a week. Probably can't go below 2. And so we already know that the system is accepting, you know, the CT system is accepting, you know, 90-day certificates for the vast majority of Earths. So my sense is there's no actual problem here, and you should just go forward.
Yeah, I have a slightly different approach that arrives at the same conclusion. Is, you know, CT is going to have to arrive at some solution for short-lived certs anyway, regardless of this document, because there's multiple different fronts from which that's coming. And it seems like their problem, not a problem for this document to solve. I say that wearing my CT shirt.
Cool, authoritative then. Yeah, and then there's this side meeting, this board that Joaf is leading, documenting STAR in general, right? Not as a in general, independent of the actual infrastructure that is used for issuance and cancellation, unauthorized cancellation. So, for example, Anima or Acme or a proprietary solution, whatever. So we have a side meeting in Hullet today at 6 p.m. You're very welcome to join, to bring your concern or use cases.
Okay, I was going to plug that, but the idea there is not to talk about the Acme or any particular issuance method, but about the considerations for using short-term certificates in terms of clock accuracy, security, and stuff like that. So yeah, like it says there, 6 p.m. at the Hallett Room. Which leaves us with just one more presentation. Oh, anything about the star? Cool. So
Actually, just one quick question out of curiosity for the authors. Have you had any chats with CAs about whether anyone's interested in deploying this? Okay, cool.
Repeat it for the mic, Richard.
I think he said DigiCert.
DigiCert approached us about this, and they said the granularity was down to 8 hours.
Before you go, so how many people in the room have read the document? Raise your hands. All right, so more than the usual standard. All right. Good.
okay, so who's presenting this? The Acme IP?
I think Alex Roland.
Oh, okay. Roland, are you in the room? Or in the other room?
He submitted, so he knows he's supposed to be here.
Yeah, just a couple of hours before.
Yeah. Something slow. Great shot. All right. Oh, I can announce it. Jacob.
So we can do the open mic first. He's not in the job room?
No.
Yeah.
All right. So since our last two presenters have fallen off the net, we will adjourn early unless anyone else has other business they'd like to bring up. I see someone with Mike.
Ben Schwartz. Is anyone here planning to implement the IP name type?
I'm not.
I can't speak for the authors, but I believe that the Let's Encrypt guys proposed it because they are thinking about implementing it. Do you have any opinions on whether it should be implemented?
I think they've said on the list that they were going to. Roland said.
Yep, I want one.
Why? That's a leading question.
I am on a team that works on an open source project that involves users being able to launch their own secure cloud services. Currently, we don't have a way for those users to access their service, which is launched in a VM of their own creation in a web browser. We've had to write our own clients and do everything outside of browsers because the endpoints don't have a name, don't have a domain name. So there's no way for them to acquire certificates. So there's no way to establish a secure connection. And we don't want to put them all under some DNS name of our control, both because that gives us too much control over them and because it makes it identifiable that a user is specifically accessing one of our services. So that means that every TLS connection is marked with an SNI that says this is the kind of software that I'm accessing. It means that it's preceded by a DNS query that identifies the kind of software that I'm accessing and invites somebody to block access to that software. So having connections that are essentially not specific to the specific kind of software that is running on the VM that we're launching would be great, and it seems like IP-based certificates would be a good way to do that, but that's not a matter for the working group.
Of course, if you're the only people running IP search, you're still the same problem.
Though less so with TLS 1.3. Yeah, you're saying yes, and I'll give you a.
Naoki Kambe, JPLS. I am interested in interrupt test for Acme protocol. Is there any plan to do interrupt test?
I'm not aware of any specific plans for interrupt tests. There has been some discussion on the list of implementations, and so it might be a useful thing to follow up on that with a request for a proposal for an interrupt test.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, every working group gets a free wiki. We could put up a table that shows interop. So if you would start the discussion by posting to the list, we'll take the item to make a table, and people can find instances and test against them or with them.
Yeah, and certainly we could do something like target the hackathon at the next IETF meeting. Would be an very easy thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're adjourned. Look for a holiday season Acme draft. Everyone please review it. And then pick up your phones and read the STIR documents. If you haven't signed the blue sheet, please come up front, the Christmas draft, and we'll expect to see you in London. Holiday of your choice, whatever. Arbor Day, that's right. Festivus. Thank you. Hey, Valerie. Pleasure to meet you. Yeah, thanks for UTA, right? You coach your UTA. Yeah, sure. That's right. We can do it in parallel.
Why?
She asked who's shepherding the main document.
Oh no, he's an author.
It's not me, so I guess it's you.
No. I thought we had someone who was going to shepherd. Someone from Let's Encrypt who wasn't an author. As a learning experience. Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. Roland was doing the CAA draft. So yes, right. Okay. I'm confused. No, I guess one of us was not do it.
There's already a shepherd writer. Somebody wrote it. Yeah.
Let's get this right. We got the time.